Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and welcome to episode 6 of Book Musings. In this episode, I'm going to take a look at a book I just finished up a couple days ago called Conspiracy Theory in America by deHaven-Smith. So, in this episode, as I usually do, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background or explain why it is I came to read this particular book. It's been on my radar for a little while now, so I'll elaborate a little bit on that. I'll talk a bit about what the book is about. Actually, I'll give it a kind of an extensive account of what the book's about. He does explore some interesting facets of conspiracy theory in a way, and this is going to be really one of the things I'll try to pick up on, in a way that I hadn't really thought of before, at least in a few different ways. Different things. He brings them up, explores them, analyzes them in interesting ways. Let's just put it that way, and I'll mention some of these as we proceed here. But yeah, you're going to get an account of what the book's about, and I'll mainly do this by going, so he offers 6 chapters in addition to an introduction. It's very much an academic book, although it's very much accessible. So a lot of academic books, that's not the case. But there's 6 chapters here, plus an introduction, and so what I'll do is kind of go chapter by chapter, discussing the themes that he brings about in each chapter. And then I'll conclude by offering, some of my own thoughts. What did I think of the book in general? What sort of grade is it going to get, right? Is it going to make the highly coveted Book Musings Hall of Fame and perhaps even the top shelf? We shall see. Stay tuned for that. But that's kind of the game plan here for the episode. So I'll go ahead and dive in here. What was the impetus for me actually reading Conspiracy Theory in America by deHaven-Smith? Well, I can't actually remember why it was in particular that I picked this up. My best recollection has me buying this on Amazon and being intrigued. So if I remember correctly, being intrigued by the basic sort of him offering a history of the label conspiracy theory. And so what really grabbed my attention, which is probably the case for a lot of people that come to this book, is this notion that the CIA, right, one of our top intelligence agencies, introduced this notion or this label of a conspiracy theory in an attempt to squelch a lot of the alternate views and theories regarding what happened to President JFK. And so that, if I recall correctly, is kind of what drew me to the book, this suggestion that he's going to offer a history of the label conspiracy theory and talk a bit about how the CIA played a critical role in the development of this label conspiracy theory. And I'll be honest. So if anybody that knows me knows that I entertain conspiracy theories, or at least it's my nature to question things, right? So I've explored various conspiracy theories. It's in my questioning nature. And as he points out, deHaven-Smith points out, and I agree with him as he develops this point throughout the book. He gives instance after instance, account after account of times where the government has lied to us for whatever reason, right? Of course, there's, the ostensible reason is never really the ultimate reason. But given this, right, documented, you can't argue with it. It is not a conspiracy theory in the normal, everyday sense of the term. It's like documented fact. Given that this has happened so many times, and I'll outline some of these instances later on, right? He gives an entire table that I'm going to outline later, where I think he offers 27 different, instances where this has been the case, and he rates the culpability of the government, how likely we know that they're involved, and it's from medium to very high, and this is given like court cases and other documents that have been released after the fact. So given that we have all these instances of known government corruption, lying to the people for whatever reason, I can't help personally but be suspicious of whatever the official account is of whatever, right? I mean, I'm almost at the point personally where whatever the government says, I don't take it that seriously, really. I'm always questioning, and it was nice to have someone who seems to feel similar in Lance deHaven-Smith here. And so I guess it's, the point here, that the reason why I'm raising it here is it's not surprising, I guess, that I was kind of drawn to this book. Very skeptical for many of the reasons he'll articulate in the book of the government and what they're telling us. Unfortunately, I'd like to be more of a believer and, more idealistic and think that the powers that be have our actual interest in mind. But again, just given what's actually happened throughout history, it's hard for me to to do that, to have that kind of faith. And so, actually, I want to start before I dive into what the book's about. Then I kind of already intimated that, but I like this quote. I think it's a good place to start. So this is on the top of page 173 of the book. deHaven-Smith writes, quote, "The elephant in America's living room is the well-known but seldom acknowledged fact that the nation's citizens do not believe much of what their government says, especially about events with which the government itself is in some way connected." And again, that really resonates with me. Probably one of the reasons why I was drawn to this book. So I did want to talk a little bit about what the book itself is about, and I will be referencing quotes extensively throughout the book to kind of give you an idea of the flavor and what he's up to here. So in general, he's offering a kind of history of conspiracy theories in America, or at least kind of our perception of what is known as or thought of as conspiracy theories nowadays, kind of how that's been perceived throughout America's history. So not just recently, but going all the way back to the founding fathers. And he has some very interesting reflections to offer with respect to that, which I'll get into as we proceed here. Right. So again, he's offering an account of conspiracy theories and how they've been received in popular culture, amongst politicians, amongst everyone, really. He gives kind of a historical account. And he begins with this idea that the country itself was founded on an actual conspiracy. So, quoting page 7 from the text, quote, "From the nation's beginning, Americans were fearful of secret plots by political insiders to subvert constitutional governance. Those who now dismiss conspiracy theories as groundless paranoia have apparently forgotten that the United States was founded on a conspiracy theory. The Declaration of Independence claimed that, quote, a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, end quote, by King George proved the king was plotting to establish, quote, an absolute tyranny over these states, end quote." So I thought it was interesting how it kind of begins by pointing out things weren't always like they are now. You bring up conspiracy theory for a lot of Americans, and it's like, they immediately dismiss it, as he points out. That wasn't the case at all. Going back, and that's going to be one of the main themes, as we'll see, that is elaborated throughout the book. There was a much greater respect amongst politicians, amongst laymen, for this notion that there is political intrigue, that there are conspiracies happening, right, at the state level. And he elaborates and talks about how, in fact, some of our founding documents had these worries in mind, right, that these kinds of threats do happen and do exist, and that we need to be on guard against them. So again, I like how he kind of begins by pointing out that our very founding was established on a conspiracy theory, right, that the king was going to then do all sorts of dastardly things to the colonies. But we'll get into more than like the history. That's what he then fleshes out throughout the rest of the book. We'll get into some of those historical aspects more as we proceed here. He also, in general, I want to point out here from the outset before we dive into the 6 chapters, he develops this, what's kind of unique here. What he brings to the table is this idea of a SCAD, which is the acronym SCAD, right? It stands for State Crime Against Democracy. And I think in general, kind of one of the reasons he's introducing it and talks about it is because he wants to kind of distance himself as much as is possible from the bad vibes, if you will, that are now associated, thanks to the CIA, with conspiracy theory, with that label, right? So let's instead call it something else. And he also emphasizes, as we'll see as we proceed here, that with SCAD, so maybe I should put that up here somewhere, State Crime Against Democracy. And he says, look, the defining feature here and what maybe distinguishes it, a SCAD from a conspiracy theory, is that with a SCAD, we have documented, proof that there was an overt action, that something took place to undermine democracy, the popular interest of the people. Whereas with conspiracy theories, or at least the common day, everyday sort of connotation we associate with those, there's like this open-ended nature to them, that may or may not have happened. No, he wants to differentiate SCAD in the sense that, hey, look, these are concrete, documented instances where we've had a crime committed, right, against democracy in this case, by the hands of the state or high political officers, right? This is another way of what does he mean by state? Politicians, right? People with a great deal of power, that are in various positions within the state. Okay, so I wanted to mention kind of what he's up to in general, and then he's developing this idea of a SCAD, state crime against democracy. He's doing that throughout the book. And now let's go ahead and dive in and talk about what he's doing in each chapter. Chapter 1, for the most part, is kind of an introduction. So he has an introduction, but chapter 1 is still kind of, I think, introductory in nature in large part. He outlines the general history of the conspiracy theory label. And of course, he's going to delve into this in much more detail when he gets into the CIA involvement and so on in later chapters. But again, that's kind of chapter 1. Excuse me. Again, very much introductory in nature along the lines of the introduction itself. So chapter 2 explains how we've shifted from sort of, and I kind of got into this, right? Here's where he gets into this in much more depth. How the historical shift, right? Where we started with this emphasis on, hey, conspiracies happen, high political intrigue and conspiracies, they happen, and this emphasis on part of the founding fathers to do what we can to squelch them before they happen, right? And do what we can, right? Implement these checks and balances and so on. How we went from that to then where we are nowadays, where any sort of suggestion that there's anything conspiratorial on the part of high-ranking political people, that's preposterous, and people that suggest this sort of thing are oftentimes, as he suggests, ridiculed from the outset, right? And their claims just dismissed out of hand. Okay, so he, surprise, surprise, as I've intimated already, is going to locate the shift in the 1960s, in particular after JFK is assassinated. Was that November 22nd, 1963, I believe. I'll have that specific date coming up. I think that's right. And then later on, I want to say in 1967 or 1968, they send out then this memo. And so what she suggests then is like them trying to instill this notion of a conspiracy theory, right? So they mention it for the first time, and he talks about this memo, more on that in a moment. And it's at that point then when the CIA gets involved, the whole thing was trying to, because no one believed the Warren Commission report, right? The official findings in terms of what happened to JFK. At least that's what deHaven-Smith suggests, and I tend to agree with him. And so, officials were worried about this, especially the powers that be, if you will, those in the CIA. And so, he suggests then they're instituting this, what really amounts to a program of propaganda. And they send out, again, I'll say more about this particular note that they send out to their officers, which basically says, try to squelch as best you can any suggestion of ulterior views with respect to what happened to JFK, right? And try to ridicule them and suggest they're ludicrous, and do what you can to basically demean them and squelch them as best you can. So he points, again, much more on this as we proceed, but basically he's going to suggest that this whole shift in how we sort of perceive conspiracy theories, it all lies in what the CIA did, more or less, after JFK was assassinated in the 60s. So he also provides a lot of examples of how conspiracies were much more, you might say, instrumental before the CIA intervention in the 60s. So again, and what I mean by that is, so he talks about how it was very much commonplace for not only the people to suspect these kinds of things going on amongst high-ranking officials, but the politicians themselves. Whereas nowadays you don't hear anything like this amongst politicians, or in general, people scoff at the idea of conspiracy theories. Well, he points out and gives lots of examples of how, in fact, that wasn't the case at all. Again, going into especially the 1960s, but going into like 1900, the 19th century, he offers countless examples of again where conspiracies were sort of voiced. Conspiracy theories were voiced not only by laymen or average everyday people, but by politicians, high-ranking politicians. So, for example, he, after discussing the Hamilton-Burr duel, which is really interesting in itself, he discusses several instances of 19th century conspiracies, as I alluded to a moment ago. So, real quick, I wanted to cite what he says with respect to that. So he says, again, this is from pages 64 to 65 in, I believe it's chapter 2. Quote, for the next 100 years, so this is in, again, the 1800s. So right around basically from the Hamilton-Burr duel for the next 100 years, he's saying. Quote, for the next 100 years, American statesmen regularly voiced suspicions regarding anti-democratic conspiracies when circumstantial evidence suggested hidden intrigue. 19th century conspiracy theories included, among others, Andrew Jackson's allegations of a corrupt bargain between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay to give the presidency to Adams in 1824, Abraham Lincoln's charge made on the floor of the House of Representatives that President Polk had fabricated a reason to initiate the Mexican-American War, claims by the chief prosecutor that the assassination of President Lincoln had been organized and financed by top leaders of the Confederacy, the theory that the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was intentionally drafted by railroad-connected congressmen to precipitate court rulings granting the rights of individuals to corporations, and suspicions that, contrary to the government's claims in launching the Spanish-American War, the U.S. battleship Maine had not been sunk by a Spanish mine, but had been deliberately sunk by U.S. or Cuban operatives to precipitate the war. So these are all examples, again, that's 64 to 65, that deHaven-Smith cites as conspiracy theories that were voiced not just by everyday people, but by politicians themselves. So then chapter 3 delves into the conceptual work that was kind of at play, he thinks at least, that maybe precipitated and influenced a lot of this change as well. So he gets into, so what's going on behind the scenes in academia, if you will. So he talks a lot about Charles Beard, or Bird, I don't know how to pronounce that necessarily, B-E-A-R-D. On the one hand, so this Charles, I guess I'm going to call him Beard, Charles Beard. He's, much more of in the vein of deHaven-Smith, skeptical, outlining conspiratorial sort of suggestions and claims, and suggesting why we should be on guard against high-ranking political intrigue. And then on the other hand, he references Karl Popper and Leo Strauss as kind of laying the groundwork for then the shift and precipitating our view nowadays of conspiracy theories, where they're kind of dismissed, right? Almost out of hand without really any real reflection or consideration. So he suggests Karl Popper and Leo Strauss, again, were very much influential with respect to this shift. I'm not going to get too much into kind of what they were up to academically, if you will, or what their theories were. I'll mention a few, sort of quotes that are along these lines, sort of establishing what I've suggested here. But again, the bottom line or the idea is he thinks that their sort of theories might have been kind of what the CIA, I guess, was working with, or those who pushed for this alternative view of conspiracy theories, what are now known as conspiracy theories, what they might have had in mind, right? He thinks, deHaven-Smith, he thinks it might have been highly influenced by, again, Popper and Strauss. So page 23, I wanted to reference here. He says, for example, as Popper and Strauss's ideas entered universities and influenced teaching and research, conspiracy theories of all kinds came to be lumped together and condemned, including plausible suspicions of crimes in high offices. Pages 78 to 79, in a similar vein. Although Popper and Strauss, so this is a quote from 78, although Popper and Strauss arrived by different routes, they agreed that conspiracy theories can fuel totalitarian political movements that threaten respect for human dignity, popular sovereignty, and the rule of law, end quote. So Charles Beard, so I mentioned him, right? He was famous for tracing features of the U.S. Constitution to the financial interests of the Constitution's framers. So again, he's kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, drawing our attention to the idea that, hey, these conspiracies do happen. And I guess he was famous then for suggesting that the founding fathers, those who framed the U.S. Constitution, that they might have some financial interest at play. So in his last book, this is continuing on page 79, which appeared shortly before his death in 1947, Beard made a strong case that President Franklin Roosevelt provoked the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and withheld from military commanders in the Pacific intelligence about when and where the attack would occur. A little bit later down the page, Beard's conspiratorial accusations took on grave significance, and yet America's political class assigned them little importance, having concluded in the wake of the Allies' victory that Roosevelt's tactics may have been deceptive, but his policy had been vindicated. 87, I wanted to mention something from 87. So, quote, this is from 87, democracy and respect for human dignity depended on salutary myths and noble lies that must be propagated by a special class of philosophical elites who are dedicated to guarding the society's values and traditions. So that's a quote describing sort of Strauss's view, kind of justifying, if you will, the things that the state has to do, right? Justifying, if you will, the kinds of conspiracies that might have to happen in order for the state to defend our ultimate interests. Okay? Again, deHaven-Smith is not going to be of that mindset, but this is the sort of suggestion at play thanks to Strauss. Strauss suggested this sort of thing, okay? And that's the kind of justification you get is deHaven-Smith's idea, right? That's the kind of justification you get then for some people at least, why, hey, even if these conspiracies do happen, why maybe they're inevitable or why we have to allow them. They're kind of a necessary evil, if you will. So that was 87. Going back to Beard, this is 89. So like what he's up to. So there's Popper, and Leo Strauss on the one hand, right? And then Charles Beard, I'm calling him, on the other hand. Charles Beard, this is a quote from 89, Charles Beard argued throughout his career that American democracy had been repeatedly manipulated by political insiders for personal gain or to serve hidden agendas. Okay, so again, he's drawing our attention to that these do happen and suggesting that, hey, we need to focus on them and do something about them, whereas deHaven-Smith suggesting that the other two, Popper and Strauss, they're doing kind of the opposite. If anything, right, if nothing else, they're suggesting why we ought to allow these sorts of things to happen, provided they do happen, right? Why they're kind of maybe necessary for the state's survival. Okay, at least that was the idea we just got from Strauss. Finally, along these lines, I wanted to mention something from page 97. Quote, in effect, Strauss believes state political crimes, insofar as they reinforce the society's values and myths, are necessary and beneficial because without them, liberal democracies are doomed to become totalitarian or to be conquered by totalitarian regimes. So again, there you get the idea from Strauss that I think a lot of people then sort of buy into, whether consciously or not, that it's kind of a necessary evil. We have to allow them to do these kinds of things, to spy on us when they say they're not, and so on and so forth, because it's ultimately necessary to ensure the survival of the state, if you will. And again, one of the things he's going to try to argue or suggest is that, hey, we need to get rid of that line of thinking because it's allowing all sorts of abuses of power. Okay, so that was chapter 3. Chapter 4 then really gets into the CIA's role then in terms of this shift that we see, at least deHaven-Smith suggesting that we see, particularly in the 60s, in the 1900s, but especially in the 60s, he suggests. Again, the shift in how we, not only we everyday people, but politicians as well, and how they sort of talk about, conceive of, and think about conspiracy theories. That these sorts of things happen by high-ranking political people, right? These things meaning tampering with, electoral processes and, doing whatever it takes to assassinations, doing whatever it takes to assume positions that they, the politicians, particular politicians or the operatives in the CIA, the politicians they want to assume, these particular positions, whatever's necessary, right, to have them assume these positions. So he gets into, again, the CIA's role in all of this. He talks about, for example, how it affects academics too, or how it affected academia as well. So page 103 talks about that. How, in other words, how not only did we see a shift in terms of how most people sort of viewed conspiracy theories, or what we call conspiracy theories now, thanks to the CIA, right? How they suddenly began to sort of start dismissing them and not really taking them seriously. He's pointing out, emphasizing that this trend also took place in academia, okay, which is even more interesting, at least in my mind. Here it is. Quote, this is from 103, the failure of all major research and theoretical traditions in the U.S. social sciences to investigate the possibility of strategic interventions by national security elites and covert operatives into U.S. domestic politics can be reasonably attributed to powerful norms in academia, as in the broader society, against speculating about possible mischief in high office. Indeed, it is likely that the CIA propaganda program to instantiate the conspiracy theory concept in America's civic culture was directed as much toward intellectuals as ordinary citizens. So he points that out on page 103. And then on 105, he writes, quote, it is quite possible that the social sciences are studying shadows and that the people making the shadows are designing them for effect. Of course, this was how Plato described the situation of the citizens, except that in his story, which we must assume was a noble line, the philosophers were helping citizens understand the shadows, not using the shadows for social control. End quote. So he gets into the general history again of the CIA's propaganda campaign against conspiracy theories. Okay, so going to 107. So where did this all begin? As I mentioned, it was all in response, or he suggested it's in response to JFK's assassination, and essentially people not buying into the official account, right? The Warren Commission, the report, the official report on what happened. Nobody, he suggests from the get-go, no one bought into it. So he writes on page 107, quote, as doubts about the official account mounted, people also started to question first the objectivity of the Warren Commission and then the integrity of American democracy. It was at this point that the CIA launched its propaganda campaign. So again, he's locating it. Where does this shift begin? It begins with the CIA and this propaganda campaign it launches in response to no one believing the official story about JFK's assassination. So that was 107, 117, 118, very similar. Quote, he writes on 117, quote, the CIA propaganda program was designed to interject a new group into the pantheon of political groups Americans employ to pigeonhole political candidates, issues, movements, and so on. In this case, the group was called conspiracy theorists, and its beliefs were described abstractly as conspiracy theories about the assassination of President Kennedy. However, like other group labels in American politics, the conspiracy theory label was and is sufficiently vague and general to be applied to many other events, issues, and individuals in addition to the assassination of President Kennedy. So that was page 117. Then on 118 he writes, quote, in the shadows of McCarthyism and the Cold War, this warning was delivered simultaneously to hundreds, if not thousands, of well-positioned members of the press and a global CIA propaganda network, infusing the conspiracy theory label with powerful negative associations. And so he's referencing there that, what's the word for it? The CIA dispatch that they sent out to all their agents when they told them, and I'll say more on this in a moment, to actually be my next main point, CIA dispatch 1035-960 to be specific, where they, the CIA basically tells its agents to do whatever they can to make light of alternative views of what happened to JFK, right? Just try to get as many people as possible to dismiss them, to dismiss these alternative views, right? The non-official view of what happened to JFK. What was the official view? Again, that he was struck by one bullet, right, from behind. Okay? And one of the things deHaven-Smith suggests, is that he was actually shot from the front and so on and so forth. But yeah, so again, they send out this dispatch, and so that's what was referenced on 118 there. Page 123, quote, together with CIA dispatch 1035-960, John Roche's letter, and he's a guy that wrote sort of these editorials at about the same time. I think he was affiliated with the CIA. His letter is, so that dispatch and John Roche's letter is demonstrable evidence that the CIA manipulated the press to popularize the term conspiracy theory, to associate it with deranged thinking, and to encourage bullying attacks on Americans who expressed doubts about the official story of President Kennedy's murder. And then a little bit later down on page 123, quote, the term conspiracy theory had only a very brief history before Roche and others carrying out the CIA propaganda program boosted the term's use and caused or contributed to its association with flawed thinking, end quote. And then on page 131, he writes, quote, this is at the very end of chapter 4, I believe, yeah. Quote, thus, the conspiracy theory label has become a powerful smear that, in the name of reason, civility, and democracy, preempts public discourse, reinforces rather than resolves disagreements, and undermines popular vigilance against abuses of power. Put in place in 1967 by the CIA, the term continues to be a destructive force in American politics. And that's how I think dramatically he kind of ends his, in chapter 4. But along those same lines, right, of this, what the CIA is doing here, on page 154, he writes, so this is later in a subsequent chapter, quote, the 1967 CIA propaganda program shows that the United States government has been actively engaged in engineering America's civic culture and has been alarmingly effective at doing so. It appears that one of its methods is to insert memes into the culture through a global network of media contacts and assets, end quote. And I'll get a little bit more into like this idea of how the CIA interjected these memes, like the idea of 9/11 and so on, a little bit later. But yeah, so again, that's him elaborating on this notion that the CIA is getting involved and trying to curb sort of, and again, not only the popular, opinion, right, but also how politicians sort of discuss issues as well, curb, right, how it was that they came to curb that sort of thing. So that was from page 154. And then finally, 186. Quote, America's national security elites deployed the conspiracy theory label and used propaganda to develop associated norms against doubts about the lone gunman and magic bullet theories underpinning the official account of JFK's murder. And then later on page 186, the CIA, this is a quote, the CIA's campaign against conspiracy theory launched in 1967 was a riveting success. The conspiracy theory label eventually became normative in polite society, and comments about signs of elite crimes of any kind were driven from the media, end quote. And that actually ends on page 187. So thanks to the CIA and this extensive sort of attempt to, again, curb how we and everyone really think about these political conspiracies, a lot less was made of conspiracy theories. They were discussed a lot less. As he mentions, they're driven from the media. The media doesn't bring them up anymore. And one of the issues I'll mention a little bit later is fast forward nowadays, any sort of mention of conspiracy theory is a reason to get kicked off YouTube, it seems, right? So there's this even sort of, you might say, censorship revolving around, this sort of very issue. Okay, I mentioned the CIA dispatch 1035-960. So he discusses that at length. Obviously, that's very a sort of critical piece of evidence for him and his claim that the CIA was so instrumentally involved in our change in sort of how we view conspiracy theories and are having the very conception of conspiracy theory. So again, that dispatch was very sort of instrumental to his view, right, and to his suggestion that the CIA was involved. So page 108, he reflects on that dispatch and sort of describes what it's ultimately up to. He says, quote, essentially, Dispatch 1035-960 instructed CIA agents to contact journalists and opinion leaders in their locales about critics of the Warren Commission, in other words, the standard report about what happened to JFK. Ask for their assistance in countering the influence of conspiracy theorists, end quote, who were publishing conspiracy theories that blamed top leaders in the U.S. for Kennedy's death, and urge their media contacts. So in other words, again, this is the CIA sending out this dispatch, okay, talking to their agents and operatives, and urge their media contacts, so to the operatives, urge you, do what you can with your media contacts. Urge their media contacts to criticize such theories and those who embrace them for aiding communists in the Cold War, trying to get attention, seeking to profit financially from the Kennedy tragedy, and refusing to consider all the facts, right? So they're, end quote. So basically, the idea is suggest all these things about these various conspiracy theorists, right? Smear them as much as you can. That's what was suggested in the CIA dispatch 1035-960, according to deHaven-Smith. So then, moving on to chapter 5, he explores then his idea of a SCAD in a little bit more detail. So he highlights also what he thinks we can glean. One of the kind of themes is that one of our issues and why he thinks why so many average everyday people in America aren't at least sort of perturbed by what's going on is that, and this is again by design, he suggests, is that we're sort of conditioned to and learn to take these things as they happen case by case, individually, segment by segment, one by one. And so one of the things he suggests early on in chapter 5 is that with this concept of the SCAD is that he wants us to widen our purview, to back up a bit. And he thinks analyzing, the state crimes against democracy implicitly does this for us, right? Has us kind of take a step back. And when we do so, he thinks, right, when we analyze these things that have happened over time and don't get so bogged down by the particulars in the one particular event, he says we'll start recognizing a lot more patterns and see a lot more evidence that we might not have otherwise seen for the idea that there are conspiracies happening, that people are doing things that they shouldn't be and who have positions of power, right? So, page 23, he says something that speaks to this. And actually, this is a recurring theme throughout the rest of the book. So he says this very early on. He says on page 23, quote, the SCAD patterns point to military and military-industrial interests as likely suspects in SCADs that foment social panic, encourage militarism, and are associated with wars. So that's going to be something actually I'll have. He says that basically over and over and over. And I'll highlight other instances where he points that out. So again, if we kind of take a step back, we'll recognize these patterns. The most striking of which he says is that there seem to be a lot of these state crimes against democracy that are done for militaristic, the military-industrial complex for their benefit, right? For the benefit of the people in positions of power within these, the military-industrial complex, more or less. Okay. He does come out, and actually this is way in the introduction, he speaks to what a SCAD is. I've already defined it, come out and try to suggest what he means by it. But he himself comes out and says, this is very early on, quote, the SCAD construct, so this is page 11, does not refer to a type of allegation or suspicion. So this is actually when he's trying to juxtapose it with our general conception of conspiracy theory and why he thinks it might be more beneficial to work with his idea of SCAD. So he says, in contrast to conspiracy theory, quote, the SCAD construct does not refer to a type of allegation or suspicion. It refers to a special type of transgression, an attack from within on the political system's organizing principles, end quote. And then on the next page, page 12, he writes, quote, SCADs are defined as concerted actions or inactions by government insiders intended to manipulate democratic processes and undermine popular sovereignty. Examples of SCADs that have been officially proven include the Watergate break-in and cover-up, the illegal arms sales and covert operations in Iran-Contra, and the effort to discredit Joseph Wilson by revealing his wife's status as an intelligence agent. So again, that's from page 12, and he actually gives all sorts of other, which we'll get into in a little bit, all sorts of other examples of SCAD. So he develops this idea of SCAD as he proceeds then in chapter 5, writing on page 136, quote, the SCAD concept is intended to function like a corrective lens to shift the standpoint and widen the angle of political crime observation, end quote. Again, let's back up. Let's analyze these things that are happening perpetually over time, right? Let's not get so bogged down in the particulars of the moment, and we'll recognize a lot more of these patterns that are developing. Page 138, he writes, quote, Americans are largely unaware of it, but they have been trained by the nation's increasingly defensive political elites with the help of a complicit media to avoid seeking or looking for connections between political crimes. In contrast, SCAD research begins by looking at SCADs and suspected SCADs collectively and comparatively. Again, he thinks that's a boon to his process or this idea and working with this concept of SCAD. By the way, over half, 56% of SCADs that he's going to reference at least, are highly confirmed, typically by, so how do we know? In other words, highly confirmed that the government was involved. How do we know? As he said, so over half, 56% of the SCADs are highly confirmed, typically by court rulings, official documents, recordings, or memoirs. So that's a quote from page 138. And then on 139, he writes, I think interestingly, SCADs have, this is a quote, SCADs have greatly increased in frequency since 1945 and especially since, surprise, surprise, 1960s. A simple review, this is further down on 139, a simple review of elections makes it clear that American democracy has been repeatedly undermined by violence and insider manipulations. Presidential elections were impacted by assassinations, election tampering, and/or intrigues with foreign powers in 1964, 1968, 1972, 1980, 2000, 2004, and so this book, by the way, was written in 2013. I think we've had our fair share of, or at least supposed election issues, right, and subsequent, right, since he wrote this book or published this book, since, you know, in subsequent elections as well. So his point stands even more if you consider that. So again, that's the idea of SCAD, and he points out, interestingly, I thought, that the Nazis performed these state crimes against democracy when the democratic processes they had at their disposal didn't work. When they couldn't take office and positions of power by the means available, then they started committing these crimes against these democratic processes, and he gets into that. So along those lines, page 72, he talks about that. He writes, quote, the Nazis were unable to win control of parliament through electoral process. The Nazis, and this is a little bit later, the Nazis acquired control of parliament by committing a number of SCADs in 1933 after President Hindenburg selected Hitler to head the cabinet as Chancellor of the Reich. So he then goes on to enumerate, you know, what he thinks those amounted to, right? But I thought it was interesting how he draws parallels, right? So many people are so quick to demean the Nazis, I mean, for good reason, and he draws parallels to what our current government is doing to what the Nazis did, and that's just a little snippet of that. Actually, that's a prevailing theme that runs throughout the rest of the book as well. So that was mentioned on page 72, and that is a prevailing theme. You know, the theme is, again, this idea that one of the things we sort of condemn the Nazis for, and we get upset about with respect to the Nazis, well, our own government seems to be doing a lot of the same things. At least that's what he's suggesting. Okay, so I mentioned like he has a list of SCADs, and I think it would be sort of a good idea to mention those. I don't think I'll go through all of them, but you know, what are, since this is such an important concept, right? You have this idea that these crimes have happened. Well, what are they, right? Give me some examples of state crimes against democracy. And so he does just that. This is table 5.1, which I found very helpful and useful. I refer to this constantly. So this is the very end of the book. And so he outlines in chronological order, I think it's ultimately 27 of them, But starting with the Sedition Act passed in 1798, all these examples of state crimes against democracy where high-ranking political figures did something to try to undermine the interests of the people in some shape or form, right? Undermine the typical democratic processes that are in place to ensure that we don't have these kinds of abuses of power, right? They try to circumvent that somehow or some way, right? So he's giving these examples. He offers them in chronological order. He also talks about sort of who was suspected or the confirmed sort of initiator who instigated it. Also, I like this. He kind of describes the degree of confirmation that we have that the government was involved. Right, so he rates them from like high to very high to low to medium. I thought I saw very high. Maybe it's just low, medium, high. But there's several then examples of what he considers high. And I gave, I cited earlier what he means by sort of evidence, right? Court rulings, documents, whatever that comes out. Oftentimes, many years down the road, where it no longer seems to matter anymore, unfortunately, right? When we finally figure out what actually happened. So in other words, he mentions kind of what he's basing that idea of government, how sure we can be that the government was involved. What he mentioned earlier, right? And I cited earlier the sorts of things that he has in mind there. So I mentioned, what are some examples? The Sedition Act passed in 1798, and I don't know a whole lot about that. I'm not a political historian or historian in any sense, but it was more or less, if I recall correctly, sort of legislation that was aimed at kind of censorship, right? Eliminating any anti-government sort of sentiment. Of course, it was couched in ways that can't be proven and so on and so forth to sort of get it in. But the whole idea was trying to sort of eliminate any potential alternative views. And he rates this degree of confirmation of government was involved as high. So we have a lot of evidence that actually was right precipitated by the government for nefarious reasons, if you will. Other examples, Mexican-American War. So, this was the suggestion that President Polk, was this the one with Lincoln was involved? President Polk, that he, was making claims that weren't true to then incite this war that wasn't actually maybe necessary, right? So the Mexican-American War of 1846, okay, that cited the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He ranks the Secret Service was involved. There's a high rating that they were involved, he suggests. Low for the vice president. And I'll mention this a little bit later, but there's an interesting sort of connection between the vice president and president that he elaborates on that I had never really thought about. That was at play with Lyndon Johnson and JFK. This idea that, and sort of what was that issue and why JFK gets assassinated. One of the theories he posits is because JFK was a pacifist, more or less. He was much more for peace, right, pursuing peace, whereas Johnson seemed to be more the opposite, more likely to entertain war and the interests of the industrial military complex. And so what he suggests, kind of interesting, what ends up happening then is that there was no way to sort of get the vice president into the position of president by way of the Constitution or any of the legal avenues at the time. And so they had no choice but to assassinate the powers that be, the ultimate true powers, meaning, the intelligence community, the CIA, the people that want wars to profit from them, right? And since they couldn't get rid of Kennedy through any legal means by way of the Constitution, or at least at the time, he suggests, right, that was then the impetus. They killed Kennedy then to get in the vice president, who was much more likely to cater to the industrial military complex. So I thought that was kind of an interesting theme that he raises and line of argumentation that he pursues, which is pretty fascinating. And so he'll comment on how then subsequently presidents seem to catch on to this theme, right? And by the way, right after was it the 25th Amendment is snuck in and shortly after JFK is assassinated, and he suggests, basically what it does is gives the authority or different ways that the vice president can come in and take position of power over, the president, sort of eliminate the president if he sees it fit, right? It basically gives them what it does is give the vice president a legal route, so they don't have to go the route of assassination. deHaven-Smith suggests, right? A legal route to accomplish the same thing, get a president out that's not as militarily inclined, right? Then the 25th Amendment they snuck in, deHaven-Smith argues, allows them then finally a legal route to get a vice president that's more militarily inclined into the position of president, right? In a similar situation down the road, right? So he talks about that. I thought that was really interesting as well. Some other examples: the sinking of the Maine in 1898. This is the U.S. battleship sunk to precipitate war. The Spanish-American War is initiated. So we mentioned that. Pearl Harbor in 1941. Roosevelt forewarned of attacks but fails to alert Pacific commanders. That's the allegation anyway. Was it Beard that suggested that too? And he suggests there's medium evidence for that being the case. All kinds of examples. The assassination of President Kennedy. He rates the evidence as, in case you're wondering, maybe that's a kind of a standard. He rates the evidence for the government's involvement as medium, which strikes me as really odd, actually, now that I think about it. I would have thought he would have rated that as very high, but I guess a lot of the evidence would be maybe just circumstantial, though, and we'll get into some of the circumstantial evidence here in a little bit. So the Gulf of Tonkin incident, he rates that as high, the evidence for that. I'm not going to get into a lot of these, but he just gives, lots of different examples. Watergate, the likelihood of the government being involved, high for that one. 1972. Assassination of Ronald Reagan, he rates it as low. The government was involved, but there's still evidence. So in each one of these cases, there's evidence. There's still evidence, right? So when we say low, or when he says low, the idea is it's just not as much, right? But for every one of these, he says there is evidence, right, that the state, high-ranking government officials in one way or another were involved in precipitating these events. He references 9/11. For what it's worth, he ranks the evidence that the government was involved, that it was an inside job, if you will, as medium. He also cites, I guess, the anthrax letters right after 9/11. And then, where was it? False terror alerts. He mentions these. I kind of forgot about these. This drumming up this notion of terror in 2004, right before Bush was reelected. So he mentions that as well. A lot of these, towards more recently, were ranked as high in terms of the evidence for them and for government complicity. Okay, so that is kind of that table 5.1, which is a very interesting table, very useful table at the end of the book. And I just want to reiterate again, over half of the SCADs are highly confirmed, typically by court rulings, official documents, recordings, or memoirs, and that's from page 138. So moving on to chapter 6, this outlines our prospects for the future. What do we do, right? How do we deal with SCADs in the future, provided they exist, which he says, look, we have to kind of accept that, right? We have to take them more seriously, he suggests, and not accept this idea, so I've already alluded to this, right, that they're kind of some kind of necessary means to protect the state, right? Some kind of necessary means to an end, right? A necessary evil that we have to kind of accept. He thinks that's a flawed way of thinking, and it's divorcing us from our basic freedoms and rights to a very worrisome level, he suggests. Okay. He talks about, let's see, this is 163. I mentioned this a little earlier, right? How what I think is interesting. So he writes, or publishes this in 2013, and he writes at this time, or when he published it, quote, he references why public officials are considering police actions to infiltrate and disrupt conspiracy theory groups and networks. Right. So not only are sort of conspiracy theories shamed in general, but he's pointing out it's gotten worse recently in the sense that what the authorities, he would argue, right, behind the scenes are doing to sort of squelch them is becoming more flagrant, right? Censorship. And what I think is really interesting is fast forward, right, 7 years afterwards, 8 years afterwards, and like I mentioned, just in personal experience, it's hard to find some of the same stuff I found 10 years ago looking on YouTube, for example, on some of these various conspiracy theories, say Sandy Hook or 9/11 or whatever. You cannot find the same videos. You can't find the same alternative viewpoints, or at least arguments for these alternative viewpoints. They're gone, right? And someone is censoring them. So I think it's, to his point that he was mentioning, they're starting to do it. Well, yeah, they are, for sure. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And so again, he kind of outlines in chapter 6 what he's up to. What do we do? Provide there's these SCADs. He thinks, again, and I'll outline this in what I suggest in the following sort of prevalent themes, but he thinks we need to be a lot more vigilant, return more to what, the sentiments more akin to our founding fathers, right? To the founding fathers and what they had in mind and sort of how they thought of conspiracy theories, right? They were acknowledge their presence, acknowledge they existed, right? And were on guard, more importantly, on guard against them, and did what they could to ensure that the government was instituted and maintained in such a way that it would curb as much as possible any of these kind of conspiracies, high-ranking political officials doing what they shouldn't, preventing them from happening. So I mentioned prevalent themes. I want to talk a little bit about what I would consider some prevalent themes. So we went through and kind of talked about what he's up to in each of the chapters. So what are some of the more prevalent themes in the book? Well, not surprisingly, given the CIA's propaganda program with respect to this issue, he talks about how America's grown complacent when it comes to this idea that we have political, people in positions of great political power doing things they shouldn't. We've grown complacent. Americans, in other words, grown complacent with respect to this. So interestingly, he points out right away, where was this, page 26, I think, how most Americans don't accept and never did from day one, as I mentioned earlier, the Warren Report, the official account of what happened to JFK. And yet, he points out, most people remain critical of modern day conspiracies. Why is that? Why is it? How is it? And this gets back to, again, a point I've never been able to understand. How can you acknowledge that this kind of stuff has happened, that it doesn't sit well with you, that it doesn't make sense, and yet still go on as if everything's okay, or that the government's not up to some very similar shenanigans to this very day, right? So to that sort of point, he says on page 26, quote, although most Americans today reject the official lone gunman account of the Kennedy assassination, they also have doubts about conspiracy theories and those who believe them. So, that's a prevalent theme, and I think one that's certainly true, right? I don't know that the JFK one is the only one either, right? There might be one or two instances that everyone's kind of familiar with, most Americans are familiar with, where it doesn't really sit well with the official report is or the government's sort of stance on it. And yet, why is it that so many of us are so willing nonetheless to just accept everything else and not question things more? So along those lines of popular complacency with respect to what's going on, he writes on page 164, quote, the truth is that many Americans support U.S. officials and institutions even when they are implicated in anti-democratic conspiracies targeting U.S. policymaking. So even when we know they've done something, right, we still support them somehow. Simply put, there is an element in American society, perhaps a large element, that trusts the government to do what is best for the nation and that believes state manipulation of domestic politics, at least in relation to foreign affairs, is necessary even though it is usually illegal, end quote. Again, that speaks to the conspiracy realists, as he calls them, people who don't deny that these kinds of conspiracies happen, but they're just okay with them because they think that it's kind of a necessary evil. We have to allow it in order for the state to survive as a whole, right, and for our ultimate interest to be furthered. And again, he doesn't think that's a convincing argument at all, and he thinks it leads to a lot of the issues that we have and why we're so dismissive of conspiracy theories altogether. Right? So it's unfortunate, but again, he thinks that is nonetheless the way a lot of people think about this sort of thing, right? These supposed conspiracy theories. Well, okay, some people are in the mindset, okay, sure, they happen, but we have to let them do what they have to do in order to survive. Okay. So another prevalent theme, I would say, is that, or he wants to suggest, is that big secrets can be and are kept. And this was fascinating for me because one of the things that I've kind of run into when I discuss conspiracy theories with other people, especially like sort of big ones like 9/11, is how can you be sure? Not how can you be sure, but how could it be, for example, that so many people are in on it? How can it be? It's not possible, the naysayers, let's say, suggest, right, that so many people could be in on it and keep a secret. But he wants to suggest, hey, that's not convincing, and that it is possible for big secrets to be kept, and that it has happened. So he cites, for example, evidence for evidence. He cites the Manhattan Project. So going to page 35. He reflects on how that was kept hidden from not only average everyday people, but most politicians for long periods of time. So he writes with respect to that, page 35, quote, public officials are quite capable of keeping secrets. An example is the U.S. government's construction of the atomic bomb during World War II. The Manhattan Project took several years and involved tens of thousands of people, but it did not become known to outsiders, either in the public or inside the government, until the first atomic bombs were dropped. Even President Truman did not learn of the project until he had been president for a week, end quote. So I thought that was an interesting observation, and one that, I'll have to refer to next time I encounter this argument. There's no way for that to happen. There'd have to be a big conspiracy. It's too big, too many people involved, can't happen. Well, he at least gives the argument that that's not that convincing. We do have examples where large government conspiracies, were kept hidden from not only average everyday people, but from politicians as well for long periods of time. So his ultimate stance is, right, that we have to take each of these conspiracy theories, or SCADs, each one we have to assess them one by one, right? That we have no choice but to take them seriously as they come and to assess each one by one. So on page 38, he argues that, quote, there is no alternative but to engage each conspiracy theory on its own merits. Otherwise, we'll get into a lot of these other issues that we've referenced and these other susceptibilities that can be problematic. So what is another thing? Well, he is convinced, right, that these SCADs are conspiracy theories, right, that there is something behind them, that elites and intelligence agencies do these kinds of things. They commit these state crimes against democracies, and then not only that, but that they're happening with increased frequency. So I mentioned that earlier, right, especially since the 1960s, right, that they do whatever they want to get what they want, ignoring more and more, and this is where he really places a lot of the issue, right, for him comes down to this, that they're ignoring the law and the Constitution more and more as time goes by in doing the things they do. And so he gives, examples of that. Okay. So he, for example, actually, going back to the Kennedy assassination, I thought it was interesting. I talked about what happened to Kennedy's body immediately after the assassination. So going to page 42, he says, quote, in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, Johnson quickly took charge. So that was the Vice President, Lyndon Johnson. Immediately took charge, and Secret Service agents under his direction removed President Kennedy's body from Parkland Hospital and returned to D.C. with the corpse. The problem was that they violated Texas law in not first allowing an autopsy to be performed by a Dallas medical examiner. They were informed of the law, and they violated it willfully and over the strenuous objections of local authorities, end quote. So that's just one example, right, going back to the JFK assassination, of how they're doing this sort of thing. This is from page 46 along the same lines. Quote, moreover, the vice president's disregard for the law did not end with the removal of the president's body from Parkland Hospital before an autopsy could be conducted. The federal entourage destroyed critically important evidence by having the president's limousine washed, all the blood cleaned from the limo seats and carpet, and the bullet-pocked windshield and interior chrome replaced. The bullet marks and blood spatter were essential for determining the direction and number of shots fired, end quote. So again, they're wiping all this out, right? Having it washed immediately before anything can be analyzed properly. And one of the another theme is like, what can we do? What should we do? Well, he wants to say, duh, apply the same standards we would to civilian events and crimes. Apply it to political crimes, right? So cordon off the area. Don't let these other people, no matter how high-ranking they are, involved. Let the average everyday, officers involved. Let them, right, investigate the scene as they normally would. Right? So that's one of his big suggestions: is apply the same standards that we do to civilian crime to political crime. Don't let them suggest things like, well, we have to get involved, right, for the sake of national security, right? We have to take charge. Well, no, right? He's going to suggest no. Apply the same standards across the board. That will help alleviate a lot of the issues. He thinks anyway. And so then page 51. This is the top 51. Quote, it appears the Kennedy assassination may have been an extra-legal but orderly action by top officials to remove the president, replace him with the vice president, and then establish procedures so that in the future, such actions could be taken without bloodshed. And then so I mentioned how he talks about how immediately after this, they kind of snuck in the 25th Amendment, which offers legal routes so you don't have to assassinate the president in the similar future circumstances. Offers legal routes for the vice president to say the president's not competent for whatever reason, right? Not really the military might. They're not going to suggest it's because the president doesn't seek military profits enough, right? But for whatever reason, the vice president can suggest the president's not fit for office, and they have a legal process. Thanks to the 25th Amendment, that they can then engage in to then oust the president that way, instead of having to go the route of assassination. And so, kind of speaking more to, hey, this manipulation happens all the time, manipulation of policy by the hands of the elites or these intelligence agencies. He talks about that on page 104. So he writes, in actuality, however, U.S. military and intelligence elites actively manipulate domestic affairs as a matter of policy, end quote. Very strongly worded there. 168, similar vein. Quote, and this goes on to 169 as well. America's political class has been operating with disregard for the constitutional framework for almost 60 years, if not longer. This is also on 169. Quote, no one, not Congress, not the people, not even presidents elected specifically to bring about change, seems capable or willing to hold this government accountable, end quote. So he thinks it's been happening routinely and more flagrantly as the years go by. Page 170, top of page 170, quote, presidents have set themselves above the law when in practice the law should apply to them more forcefully than to people in ordinary positions in the government, end quote. And I think that's a great point. He mentions this, right? And so that's oftentimes a kind of debate. People in positions of power should, when they break the law or do something untoward, right, should they be held more accountable because of the power they were allotted? Right? Well, he must say at least apply the same standards to them and hold them as accountable. But then maybe even if because we did trust them with so much power, if they are found to abuse it, right, maybe even punish them even more, right? But they're getting let off way lighter, right? Never mind, not even, it's not even the same, right? They should be maybe held to a higher standard. They're not even held to the same standard, right? They are allowed to get away with way too much. So suggests, right, deHaven-Smith. Okay. I alluded this already, right? But obviously one of the big themes then that he elaborates on is this idea that we've kind of strayed from what the founding fathers initially had in mind when they laid the groundwork for our country and the governance of our country. They were extremely suspicious of government, of people who assume positions of power. Power corrupts, right? That whole idea. And it's interesting to me how I'll have conversations with people who are very historical, that love right? History and the founding fathers in particular, who seem to have no appreciation for exactly what he's pointing out, deHaven-Smith, right? That they were very much worried about conspiracies, right? Them taking place. So kudos to him for sort of mentioning, right, that the founding fathers did have this very much in mind, and we all are familiar with this idea of like checks and balances, right? The extent to which then they went to implement these checks and balances, and he talks a lot about how a lot of us don't even think about president and vice president, how right they're not meant to be like parallel, right? They're meant to like sort of check each other as well, even within the executive branch, and how that's kind of been circumnavigated by potential crimes, you might say, or just through, political conniving or navigation, right? Political parties sort of get around that. But even presidents and vice presidents are kind of meant to be a check and balance on one another. All sorts, so he elaborates on all kinds of various ways that the founding fathers had this in mind and then tried to implement these checks and balances within our founding government documents, right? So along those lines, excuse me, page 54. So this is him citing the founding fathers, quote, their basic model for Republican government, which was to divide power into separate offices, require agreement between offices to make authoritative decisions and give each office veto powers over certain issues in some situations. Okay, so there's always like this ability to sort of veto what another element of the government is trying to instantiate and facilitate. Quote, they, being the founding fathers, also thought representative democracy was vulnerable to, in their language, conspiracies, quote, conspiracies against the people's liberties, end quote, by perfidious public officials, end quote, and to tyrannical designs, end quote, by oppressive factions. And so these are all things he's quoting the founding fathers, the language they sort of used, right? They had this all in mind, right? They were worried about these kinds of conspiracies taking place against the people's liberties. Right? So very much something that was on their mind at all times, especially given, again, the tyranny of the king at the time. Quote, this is from page 56. The political science of the founders grew from the soil of, I just mentioned this, from the soil of experience with a manipulative and tyrannical king fully schooled in the ways of power. The leaders of the revolution knew better than to wait to stand up for their rights, end quote. So that was page 56. Page 58 along these lines as well. Quote, this is at the top of page 58. The United States Constitution was designed with the expectation that public officials are likely to conspire to abuse their powers and undermine popular control of government, end quote. Again, these founding fathers, they knew this, they knew what human nature was like and that we're susceptible, right? Power is a corruptive sort of force. And so they did everything they could, so deHaven-Smith is suggesting, to eliminate that corruptive force, right? Or that potential for that corruptive force. So that was 58. And then finally, page 60. Quote, the founders' response is instructive and, when compared to contemporary derision of conspiracy belief, a sad indication of how far the quality of American leadership in journalism has fallen. And I think this is important too. So again, the founding fathers, quote, they quickly came to the conclusion that freedom of speech must be protected even if, or especially if, it maligns the government or insults the integrity of public officials, end quote. I think it's a very good point on his behalf to emphasize that, right? That our founding fathers, they weren't censoring what people were saying, even if, maybe even especially in cases where people were questioning what they were doing, right? That was allowed. It wasn't censored. Fast forward to nowadays, where I'm not sure that's the case anymore, right? So we have this like idea of freedom of speech, which they held very dearly, right? Versus national interest. And of course, so the platforms that might be censoring people nowadays, of course, it's ostensibly, you might say for the sake of national security, we can't have disinformation being disseminated and so on, right? Because it compromises our national security. That's ostensibly the argument, but again, the founding fathers, he's pointing out, would have been on the complete opposite end of the spectrum in terms of that debate. So, that was page 60. So he's arguing along, he wants to advocate for us sort of returning back to the mantra of the Founding Fathers and the mentality of the Founding Fathers. Let's return to protecting our individual rights, not let them be infringed upon for the sake of national security, for example. This is, again, the side that he thinks the Founding Fathers, right, they settled on too. So page 60, I mentioned that. Again, obvious evidence, right? They quickly came to the conclusion that freedom of speech must be protected, even if, or especially if, it maligns the government or insults the integrity of public officials. And in a similar vein, page 62, talking about Thomas Jefferson, he writes, quote, in his first inaugural address, Jefferson articulated the principle, now widely cherished as a birthright, that Americans are allowed by the Constitution to quote, think freely and to speak and to write what they think, end quote. He made it clear that in his view, this was true even for speech advocating the overthrow of the government, end quote. So, again, far from what is the case nowadays, right? I think it's completely different than what would be suggested by political officials nowadays. Okay, so I alluded to this earlier. One other major theme was this idea, if you take a step back, take a wider purview of these conspiracies that happen, or these SCADs, what you'll find out is that the military-industrial complex seems to be behind most of them. Right? That most of these crimes against democracy and against the people in general seem to be for the sake of profit, specifically those involved in the military-industrial complex. And I think we've all probably heard President Eisenhower's ominous sort of warnings, which he references, deHaven-Smith does on page 69. So, as he mentions on top page 69, as President Eisenhower warned in his farewell address, military leaders and armament manufacturers have become a military-industrial complex capable of influencing the entire direction of American government. And of course, that's what deHaven-Smith then suggests they end up doing, right? That it's exactly what ends up happening then, as we see throughout history from that point, from Eisenhower's point, right, from his famous warning. So deHaven-Smith writes on page 103 in a similar vein, in theory, national security elites would stage, facilitate, or execute events that discipline politics and policy by changing either the lineup of top policy makers or the perceived constellation of major problems and threats facing the social order. So they're manipulating these things. He talks about like the popular memes that they sort of inculcate into the popular culture. Their objectives would be to foster social panic and militarism in the American mass public and belligerency in the U.S. foreign policy, end quote. He literally says this is the theme over and over and over numerous times throughout the writing. So along those lines, page 140, a little bit later, he writes, since World War II, the main effect of most SCADs and suspected SCADs has been to foster social panic and militarism in the American mass public and belligerency in U.S. foreign policy, end quote. I feel like I just read that sentence. Quote, a little bit further down the page on 140, all of these SCADs and suspected SCADs contributed to the initiation or continuation of military conflicts, end quote. Page 149, quote, they often employ military skills and tactics, cause social panic and militarism in the American mass public, and encourage belligerency and U.S. foreign policy. SCAD patterns that have been consistent for decades point to the military-industrial complex. That was page 149. And finally, page 174. Quote, the main effect of most SCADs and suspected SCADs has been to foster social panic and militarism in the American mass public and belligerency in U.S. foreign policy, end quote. Did he literally just copy the same sentence numerous times, a la propaganda? Because it seems like it was literally the same sentence. So that's obviously a major theme that he echoes throughout, right? That if you take a step back, analyze these SCADs, a reoccurring theme seems to be war, 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 military, military, military. Strike up fear in the public, right, to then justify investing in military, right, to then feed the profit of these, to facilitate the profits of, the people that are in positions of power within the industrial military complex. Okay, so SCADs do happen, and we should be on guard against them, right? Look, they happen, he suggests. So his conclusion, right? Quote, this is from page 73, modern liberal democracies are vulnerable to being hijacked by authoritarian leaders willing to carry out ruthless conspiracies. When leaders claim to need extraordinary powers to deal with threats, citizens should look carefully at the threats and consider the possibility that the threats are contrived, end quote. So we need to be on guard, right? These do happen. Let's harken back to the mentality of the founding fathers. And again, let's apply the same standards that we apply to civilian crimes to political crimes. Along those lines, he writes, this is from page 172. So the solution, so this is again 172, quote, the solution suggested here is that when confronted by a suspected SCAD, a political crime in which the government appears to be implicated, we begin by enforcing the laws that govern criminal investigations. For example, we take the procedures we use in ordinary murders and apply them to assassinations. This includes crime scene control, interrogation of suspects, cutting deals with one suspect to catch another, and so on. Right? Let's implement those same standards. Let's not let some agency come in, remove a body, completely ignore standard procedure. No, let's implement the same standards he's suggesting. So that was 172. Page 193, he writes, in a similar vein, what we should do, right, is, quote, to allow political crimes and suspicious events to be investigated objectively and thoroughly by law enforcement professionals who are free to do their jobs without interference or influence from above. That's what we should aim for. And then 194, Americans need to start demanding proper investigations. Quote, I found this was interesting, right? It reminded me of this, I'd forgotten about it. Eyebrows were raised when President Bush and Vice President Cheney insisted on testifying together in private with the 9/11 Commission and not under oath, end quote. That was, when they're testifying with respect to 9/11. And he's saying, why? Why are they permitted these exceptions and these? Why aren't they held? If anything, they should be held, right? The bottom line, or at the very least, they should be held to the same standards. And then, as I alluded to earlier, right, he wants to make the case we should even be holding them to higher standards. Why are we allowing them to not testify under oath with one another, so on and so forth? And so he's raising red flags there, he would say. Let's instead, part of the solution would be to apply the same standard across the board. I mentioned this earlier, so I won't get into it too much, but look out if you're a president, right, who aspires for peace and then chose, hopefully you're not this stupid anymore, a vice president who is all about war, because your days might be numbered. And again, he mentions that political, people aspiring to become president nowadays seem to have caught on, right? And that's this divergence between the president and vice president. That's kind of engulfed, right? And they seem much more parallel than what the initial framers of the Constitution had intended the president and vice president, right, the positions to be. Remember, they were initially intended to be a check and balance on one another. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore, and part of that might be because, again, the president more and more is choosing a vice president who is a very similar mindset. Along those lines, page 146. So again, 146. Quote, the evidence is difficult to see in individual assassinations when they are examined one at a time. But evidence of elite involvement is quite clear when assassinations are examined together and comparatively. The targets of assassinations are officials who control foreign policy. Dovish presidents with hawkish vice presidents are assassinations waiting to happen, end quote. So again, very common theme throughout the book, how that was an issue, right? President that has a different, a more peace-like personality. If they have a running mate that's a vice president that's the opposite, look out. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here. I went through, talked a lot about what's in the book, gave a lot of quotes to really dive in and kind of give you a feel for what the book's like. So what are some of my kind of general thoughts? I'd have to say that I considered a lot of elements of at least the major conspiracy theories, but granted that he's actually pointed out some things I hadn't really considered before that I thought were particularly interesting. For example, did you know the U.S. government confiscated photos of 9/11 taken from above? I never had actually known that. I've watched a lot of videos and done my fair share of research on 9/11 and conspiracy theories and so on, and I didn't ever, I guess, come across this the fact that the U.S. government took all the pictures that were taken. So I'm going to read what he says with respect to that. So this is from the top of page 137. Decision of a, quote, the U.S. government to sequester photos that look down on the carnage. Before, during, and after the Twin Towers imploded, thousands of photos were taken of the World Trade Center from a police helicopter flying overhead. These are the only images in existence that show the destruction from above, and yet the photos were withheld from the public for over 8 years. They came out only because ABC News filed a request under the Freedom of Information Act. So, I'm going to keep going here. And the Freedom of Information Act with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the agency responsible for investigating the World Trade Center destruction. Significantly, no official explanation for sequestering these photos has been offered, despite a New York Times editorial criticizing the action after the photographs were released in February 2010. So for almost 9 years, the government had confiscated all these pictures that were taken from above and wouldn't let anyone see them. And of course, I wonder, okay, they give us the stuff 9 years later. What else do they still have that they're not giving us? I always wonder that, right? We're told, we get this this whole idea of the Freedom of Information Act. Like, they're going to give us some stuff, right? But are they ever really giving us everything? Probably not, right? So I always kind of have my suspicions on that, right? Whatever they're disseminating via Freedom of Information Act, it's probably 10 times deeper than that. At least that's how my conspiratorial mind works. So I thought that was kind of interesting. He also talked about, so I mentioned earlier how he mentions the CIA and how they got involved and they tried to sort of implement these kind of memes and ways of thinking into the pop culture. And so he elaborates on sort of one idea is this idea of 9/11 and how maybe, right, if this was a conspiracy, then the CIA, right, there's certain connotations associated with 9/11. Why is it, he points out, I thought this was interesting, why is it we remember that event by its date, 9/11, but we don't remember JFK's assassination as 11/22. We don't remember Pearl Harbor as 12/7. Right? Why is it just this one time? And so he talks about, well, let me tell you why, right? The conspiratorial interpretation would be because there's all sorts of symbolism conjured up by the number 9/11, right? It's very similar to what we dial in America if we have an emergency, 911. What does that make you think of? Trouble, security, fear, need, police, authoritative power to help come in and save us. Right, so he elaborates on that. And I thought that was pretty interesting. Why is it we remember 9/11 by its date and not by, the day planes flew into buildings or something like that? And he mentions, if we were typical, he mentioned some of the other ways we might refer to it, but no, we refer to it as 9/11. So with 9/11, he argues we've had what he calls an endless emergency. Right, more or less, it's like this endless war on terror. So again, that harkens back to this idea that it's all militarily motivated, right? So if this was an inside job, okay, well then it's precipitated this endless war, this endless emergency, this endless war on terror in response to this endless emergency. So speaking to that point, at page 158, he writes, quote, the connection between 9/11, the date, and 911, the emergency telephone number, by planting the idea that 9/11 created an emergency, turned September 11th into an event of world historic proportions, the beginning of an endless emergency, end quote. So again, that was from page 158. Winding up here, so I liked how even if you're kind of into conspiracy theories and you consider yourself well-versed in them, let's say, how he still will bring some interesting tidbits to the table that maybe you hadn't, if you're like me, hadn't thought of before. So definitely an asset thing to his credit. Okay, timeout. At this point, unbeknownst to me, when I was originally recording this video 5 days ago, I think it was 6 days ago, the video just stopped recording. At some point, about 10 minutes past what you've actually just seen, somewhere thereabouts, I kind of noticed something seemed weird because I didn't see the same lights on my computer. I finished the video nonetheless, and I didn't know what was going to happen, or at least my material I finished. Couldn't find the video at all. Thought at that point I actually had to rush out of the house and to meet my wife and my son, drive up to Omaha. It's a 3-hour drive. Immediately after taking the video, recording the video, I had to make this drive so that we could fly out for a trip that we had. And so I was doing this video right before that. And so I was under the impression, 5-6 days ago, that I couldn't find this video. It just seemed to have disappeared, that I lost this 80-minute plus video. Was it a conspiracy? I think it was a conspiracy. That was, of course, something that I pondered. What happened to this video? Why is it just completely gone? Why was it recording, then all of a sudden it just stopped? I never had that happen before. And so I'm under the impression, we went out to San Diego on this trip, and I'm under the impression this whole time that I just lost this 80-plus minute video. But come back, looking into it, I was expecting to have to, redo the whole video if I was even going to do it at all. I was kind of contemplating that, and lo and behold, it turns out that there was this recovery function through the software I used that was able to recover then this video up to this point that you've seen it then. And so I've got most of the material, and thankfully, and so I'll pick up here, but I wanted to explain, why if it's the lighting looked suddenly different, or the books are in slightly different spots. I mean, most of it I left just as it was, but if things got bumped, the computer's probably not in the same spot and whatnot. That's why I probably have slightly more facial hair. Maybe my hair is slightly longer as well, but yeah. So I don't know what exactly happened. It was recovered. It wasn't a conspiracy, as far as I know. I don't know why it cut short. But anyway, I'll just pick up right where I was then. Pretty much was almost done. I just had a few extra or other thoughts, and then I'll give you my book Musings grade in terms of Conspiracy Theory in America by deHaven-Smith. Then I had mentioned, just gotten done sort of discussing how, the author, deHaven-Smith, points out things that even someone who I consider myself fairly well versed in conspiracy theories, points out things that I hadn't actually considered or known about. So, I think that's interesting and definitely worth noting. Another sort of virtue I would say is that and I think I alluded to this earlier in the video, that it's extremely accessible. His writing style is very accessible, which is interesting to me because, it definitely, and again, I think this is a point I mentioned at some point earlier in the original video, it's an academic book. It has 6 chapters, each on a certain thing. It definitely has like an academic feel in some sense, and a lot of times those can be pretty obtuse, and so that's a credit to him that he's able to present, it's a niche sort of, again, academic writing, but it's presented in a very accessible fashion. So I think that's definitely a credit to him and his writing style. Having said those good things, and I did, enjoy the book. Again, I read it very quickly. I was expecting, I think, a little bit more. I think one of the things, so there's nothing earth-shattering about it. I've alluded to that before. I was expecting a little bit more guidance. So one of the things when I first sort of started thinking about, well, what I want to say about the book, what was he actually trying to do? That's kind of one of the things that immediately I started to think to myself, what was the overall objective? But then as I went through, I don't know, he was a little bit more, I think, he provided more of a roadmap than I initially thought upon my initial reflections. Like going back, actually, what was his overall objective? He actually points out in the introduction, he writes, this is right out of page 21, quote, "Conspiracy theory in America is about the transformation of America's civic culture from the founders' hard-nosed realism about elite political intrigue to today's blanket condemnation of conspiracy beliefs as ludicrous by definition." I just think, having, granted that, he might have been a little bit better about it than I initially thought. I still think that there was this sense as I read through it, like, okay, where are we going overall? Why are we talking about this right now? I think maybe the way to put it is he could have provided more context as we were proceeding, sort of talking about how this particular chapter then fits in as a whole to the overall project. And he does. I like how he gives a nice account of the history and so on of the label, and a lot of good things here. I just think in general is expecting a little bit more. There's nothing sort of earth-shattering going on here, and I was hoping for slightly more guidance, I guess. So summing up, moving on to, I guess, the book Musings grade. What will I give it in terms of its grade? Again, I want to repeat, there's nothing wrong with the book. I enjoyed the book, and if you're into conspiracy theories at all, definitely check it out. Again, I think that he has a lot of interesting takes on even the conspiracy theories you're probably familiar with. Right? He'll point certain things out that you might not have thought about. If you're not into conspiracy theories, I'm not sure that this is going to do anything for you. It's not going to change your mind, I don't think, in terms of, I don't know, maybe it would make an impression on some people if they would give it the time, but I don't think it's profound enough to really change too many people's minds if they're already not sort of skeptical of what's going on to begin with. One of the main things he's sort of doing, or seems to be up to, is developing this notion of SCAD, which is all right, but it's not really that profound. It's basically just an alternative sort of label in some sense for, what we typically refer to as conspiracy theories. Granted, he tries to distinguish the two. There's some nuances and differences between them, and I appreciate that. You wanting to avoid the immediate negative connotations that he elaborates on that are associated with conspiracy theories, right? The label conspiracy theory. But that's really all it does, right? I mean, it's still indicating sort of the same sort of thought that the government's doing stuff it shouldn't be, right? Or the people in high-ranking positions of power are doing things they shouldn't be, right? That are hurting the general public, right? Or democracy, as he would put it, right? Again, SCAD standing for State Crimes Against Democracy. So, I don't know, good and bad. And so I guess overall, if I have to give it a grade, and I do because that's what I do in this series, right? I'm going to give it a C+. And now another thing I wanted to mention is that it's a good book, but compared to all the other things that are out there, that's kind of the issues. There's so much competition. It's a good book. I enjoyed it. But when I just get done reviewing in the previous episode, I believe Animal Farm, one of my favorite books of all time, it's this isn't as good by comparison, right? So I give it a C+. It's still probably worth your time if you're at all into conspiracy theories, or if you're somewhat interested in them at all. Still definitely check it out, but if you have to decide between this or like Animal Farm or any of the other books up to this point really that I've reviewed, the other books might be preferred. Anyway, so that is it for Conspiracy Theory in America by Lance deHaven-Smith. I wanted to wrap up the episode by just kind of talking about what might be on tap in upcoming episodes, or at least what I'm reading or thinking about reading next, right now that I'm done with this. And so, as I mentioned, we went on this trip, and I'm going to tell you what I'm reading next because I'm already halfway through it. My wife, she said, you can't put that book down, and it was really true. The last few days I've been devouring this book. So very interesting book by Jerry Mander. I probably will do an episode on this just because it's so insightful on so many different levels. I really am very, very impressed with this book. And the fact that he wrote it back in the 70s, he expresses concerns that are just that resonate with me so much, dealing with screens, with advertising, and so on. And he has a unique perspective because he was involved in the advertising industry, I think for at least a decade, if not longer. So he has, sort of a career in that as well. Very insightful, and it goes deeper to the levels I didn't expect it at all, in terms of talking about how we've kind of abstracted ourselves from our natural environment, and everything that we do in our entire environment now is almost completely artificial and man-made or human-made. And that he thinks is the impetus for a lot of the problems we experience, and I tend to agree with him, hence my affinity or my love for the book so far. So you can probably look forward to maybe an episode on that. What else? So I've been in the midst of Propaganda by Edward Benet. I mentioned this book, in previous episodes because it's always on the radar, and I got to this point, I'm about a little bit further than halfway, reading this in the line to pick up my kids, and I have just not pushed further for a couple months. School's been out for a couple months, so I'm still about halfway through that. It is actually very much related to a lot of what Jerry Mander says in this book, so and that the overlap kind of interesting. And I'll probably eventually here finish this. My son recently finished the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series, and it pains me to say that I've never actually read it myself. So this is on the horizon as well. He was a big fan of that. And actually, it pains me to say that another series that I have never read, I've read portions and I've seen one or two of the movies, is the Harry Potter series. I've had so many people tell me it actually has philosophical sort of themes going on, and you would love it. And over the years, people have said this to me. So yeah, it's time. And so I've been listening to it actually on the road trips up to Omaha and back down on audiobook, and I'll probably continue. I'm still on book one, but probably finish that on my jogs then. And then finally, I have a good buddy that is calling it quits with alcohol. And so it kind of got me thinking, I've always kind of wrestled with alcohol and my relationship with it, so to speak. And so I picked up some books that seemed to be highly reviewed on the subject. So just to kind of understand, his position, and also, again, what do I want my relationship to be like with alcohol moving forward? Definitely something that I've thought a lot about in terms of how prevalent it is in not just our society in America, but in the world. It seems to be in a lot of different cultures. It's very pervasive, and the advertising for these cultures, I mean, it's everywhere, right? It seems to be. And so, I've thought a lot about what are the repercussions of that. I mean, our body tries to expel it as soon as we ingest it. That's probably saying that it's suggesting that it's not necessarily a good thing for us. So, point being, it's definitely something I've thought a lot about. And like I said, good buddy going quitting after what he's suggested has been some problems with it. So it's been interesting to kind of hear his take on that, his experience. He's just told me it was 6 weeks now. So anyway, that was the impetus for me then picking up some books on that. So I think that's good enough. We'll go ahead and wrap up then this episode 6. Sorry for the interruption there towards the end. Again, I don't know what happened. I'm just glad that it didn't turn out to be a conspiracy. Or maybe it did, I don't know. But at least I was able to recover the video and the material. So again, that'll wrap it up for episode 6 of Book Musings, where we took a look at Conspiracy Theory in America by Lance deHaven-Smith. I gave it a C+. Definitely check it out if it sounds interesting to you, if conspiracy theories are something you like to entertain or are at all interested in. Thank you.